It is the year 1760 in Colonial, Pennsylvania. Imagine a farmer living near Lancaster. His land is fertile. His barns are full. His harvest has been strong. By any practical standard, he is wealthy. Yet when he walks into town to buy a new iron plow, he faces an impossible problem. He has no money. Not because he is poor, but because there is simply no gold or silver to be found. The blacksmith has none. The merchant has none. The entire local economy is rich in real goods but starved of currency. This was not an accident. It was built into the structure of the British Empire. The colonies were legally forbidden from minting their own coins. Any gold or silver that entered through trade quickly flowed back to Britain to pay for manufactured goods. London accumulated the wealth, while the colonies were left with land, labor, and produce, but no medium of exchange. An economy cannot function this way for long. To survive, the colonies created their own solution. Colonial assemblies issued paper money, often called bills of credit or colonial scrip. This paper was not backed by gold sitting in a vault. It was backed by land, taxes, and the productive capacity of the colony itself. A farmer could mortgage part of his land to a colonial land bank and receive paper notes in return. Those notes could then be used to pay a blacksmith, a merchant, or taxes owed to the government. The money circulated, unlocking real wealth that already existed, but could not otherwise move. This system worked remarkably well, especially in colonies like Pennsylvania. Trade expanded, employment rose, and local economies grew rapidly. Even Benjamin Franklin later explained that this system of paper money was the main reason for colonial prosperity. It functioned as a sovereign monetary system, quietly independent of Britain, and it allowed the colonies to thrive without relying on scarce gold and silver. But not everyone benefited. British merchants and creditors hated this arrangement. When they sold goods to colonial buyers, they expected repayment in hard British currency. Instead, they often received colonial paper that fluctuated in value and could not easily be redeemed in London. To them, colonial scrip looked like a threat to profits and control. Over time, these merchants formed a powerful lobby and pressured Parliament to shut the system down. For years, Britain largely ignored these complaints. The colonies were profitable, and enforcement was lax. That changed after 1763. Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, but was buried under massive debt. The new government under King George III and Prime Minister George Grenville looked to the colonies not as partners, but as a source of revenue and control. The era of neglect ended, and direct economic intervention began. In 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act. Contrary to popular belief, it did not ban paper money outright. Instead, it stripped colonial paper of its legal tender status. This meant creditors were no longer required to accept it as payment. Overnight, colonial money was transformed from official currency into something closer to a private promise. British creditors could now legally demand payment only in gold or silver, which the colonies did not have. The effects were devastating and immediate. Paper money lost trust and stopped circulating. Trade slowed, then seized up. Farmers could not sell goods. Craftsmen could not find customers. Merchants could not pay suppliers. A deep deflationary depression spread through the colonies. This was not collateral damage. It was the intended result. The goal was to force economic dependence and restore British financial dominance. Benjamin Franklin, representing Pennsylvania in London, warned Parliament of the consequences. He explained that paper money was not a trick to avoid debts, but a necessity for daily life in the colonies. His arguments were ignored. British policymakers and creditors cared less about colonial stability than about restoring their own profits and authority. In the middle of this depression, Parliament made the situation worse. In 1765, it passed the Stamp Act, imposing direct taxes on newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and more. These taxes had to be paid in gold or silver. The demand was impossible. First, Britain removed the colonies' money. Then it demanded payment in the one form of money they lacked. This was no longer just taxation. It was economic punishment. The reaction was explosive. Resistance erupted across the colonies. Groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, made up largely of artisans, merchants, and laborers whose livelihoods had been destroyed. Stamp distributors were intimidated, attacked, and forced to resign. The law became unenforceable before it could even take effect. Colonial leaders went further, organizing widespread boycotts of British goods. Merchants agreed not to import or sell British products. This strategy struck directly at British commercial interests. Warehouses in London filled with unsold goods. Profits collapsed. The same merchant class that had demanded the Currency Act now found itself on the brink of ruin. Under intense pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Celebrations erupted in America, but the relief was short-lived. On the same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute authority over the colonies in all matters. Crucially, the Currency Act remained in force. The economic noose stayed tight. The Depression continued. The next escalation came in 1767 with the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on essential imported goods like glass, paper, paint, and tea. The revenue was earmarked to pay colonial governors and judges directly, removing their financial dependence on local assemblies. This stripped the colonies of one of their last checks on imperial power. The colonists understood the danger immediately. This was not about trade regulation. It was about control. Boycotts resumed, stronger and more organized than before. Homespun cloth replaced British textiles. Avoiding taxed tea became a patriotic act. Resistance became cultural, economic, and deeply personal. Britain responded not with compromise, but with force. Troops were sent to occupy Boston to enforce the laws and protect officials. Soldiers competed with unemployed workers for scarce jobs, inflaming tensions. In 1770, those tensions exploded into violence in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though some townshend duties were repealed, the tax on tea remained, along with the Currency Act and the Declaratory Act. The crisis was unresolved. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the British East India Company a monopoly on colonial tea sales. This undercut colonial merchants and reinforced Parliament's right to tax. The Tea Act was the final provocation. Colonists saw it as proof that their economic independence was being systematically dismantled. In Boston, resistance took dramatic form when activists destroyed shipments of taxed tea, rejecting monopoly, taxation, and distant authority all at once. Britain responded with severe punishment. The port of Boston was closed. Massachusetts' self-government was stripped away. Troops were quartered among civilians. What began as economic control had become military rule. The other colonies understood the message clearly: submission or force. In 1774, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia, no longer to protest taxes, but to coordinate resistance. Within months, armed conflict erupted. The revolution did not begin with musket fire. It began years earlier, with laws that took away money, independence, and economic self-rule. At the center of it all stood the Currency Act of 1764. It destroyed the colonial monetary system, triggered depression, and set off a chain reaction of resistance and repression. Long before shots were fired, the revolution had already begun, quietly, on paper.